Ed's vision blurred as the studio lights blazed overhead. The telegram crumpled in his sweaty palm, the words burning into his retina like a brand MS. Those initials had haunted his nightmares for 3 decades, but he'd convinced himself they were phantoms of guilt, not harbingers of vengeance. "Mr. Sullivan?" The voice belonged to Charlie Prendergast, his floor manager, whose face swam into focus like a concerned moon. "You look pale, sir. Should we—" "I'm fine." Ed's voice cracked like dried leather. He straightened his tie with mechanical precision, the same gesture that had steadied him through 1,000 broadcasts, but his hands betrayed him, trembling as if he were standing in a blizzard instead of the sweltering studio. The Beatles' laughter echoed across the stage as Paul McCartney tuned his bass. They were so young, so alive, so blissfully unaware that they were sharing the stage with a man whose past was crawling out of its grave. John's voice carried over the din. "Ed, mate, you ready for another go?" "Ready?" Ed wanted to laugh, but the sound would have been hollow, terrifying. He'd built his empire on being ready, ready for anything, anyone, any curveball the entertainment world could throw at him. But not this, never this. The telegram felt heavier than a stone in his pocket as he forced his legs to carry him toward the interview area. Each step was a battle against the undertow of memory, threatening to drag him back to that October night in 1930. The night Marcy's eyes had gone vacant, the night he'd stood frozen in their bedroom doorway, watching her finger tighten on the trigger and said nothing, done nothing. "Places, everyone," Charlie's voice boomed across the studio. "We're live in 60 seconds. 60 seconds. Ed's mind calculated frantically. 4 million viewers would see him sitting across from the biggest musical phenomenon in history. Network executives were counting on ratings gold. His reputation, his legacy, hung on maintaining the veneer of professional calm that had made him America's variety show king. But somewhere out there, in the shadows beyond the studio lights, someone who knew the truth was watching, waiting. Someone who signed their name with initials that should have been carved on a headstone decades ago. The makeup artist dabbed powder across his forehead, but it couldn't hide the gray pallor that had settled over his features like ash. "You sure you're feeling all right, Mr. Sullivan?" she whispered. "Just the excitement," he lied, forcing what he hoped was a reassuring smile. His daughter Betty would be watching from home, probably recording the interview on that new contraption her husband had bought. Betty, who kept a framed photograph of Marcy on her nightstand. Betty, who believed her mother had been a saint driven to despair by postnatal depression. What would she think if she knew the truth? That her father had watched her mother die and chosen silence over salvation? 30 seconds. Ed took his position across from the Beatles, the familiar comfort of his interviewer's chair feeling suddenly foreign beneath him. John Lennon caught his eye and winked, that cheeky Liverpool confidence that had charmed America. George Harrison adjusted his guitar strap. Paul bounced slightly on his heels, energy radiating from him like heat from a furnace. Ringo sat behind his modest drum kit, grinning as if this were all a magnificent joke. They had no idea they were about to witness the destruction of Ed Sullivan. The telegram seemed to pulse in his jacket pocket like a second heartbeat. 7 words. 7 words that contained enough dynamite to blow apart everything he'd spent 34 years building. The penthouse apartment on Central Park West, the respect of industry giants, the image of grieving widower who'd channeled his pain into bringing joy to millions. All of it built on a lie. All of it balanced on the silence he'd chosen that October night when he could have called out, could have rushed forward, could have grabbed the gun from Marcy's shaking hands. Instead, he'd stood there like a statue, paralyzed by cowardice and the terrible realization that her death would solve so many problems. The mounting debts, the threats from loan sharks, the insurance money that would give him a fresh start in the emerging world of television. 10 seconds, quiet on the set. Ed's peripheral vision caught a movement in the shadows near camera 3, a figure in a dark coat, face obscured by the studio's lighting angles, too far away to make out features, but something about the posture, the tilt of the head, the way they held their shoulders, sent ice water through his veins. She's here. The thought arrived with crystalline certainty. She's watching. 5, 4, 3. Ed Sullivan, master of ceremonies, king of Sunday night entertainment, prepared to conduct what might be his final interview. The red light blinked on, the cameras rolled, and somewhere in America, 4 million people settled in to watch the Beatles charm their way through another television appearance. They had no idea they might be witnessing a confession instead. And we're rolling. The red light blazed like an accusation, but Ed Sullivan's mouth moved with the automatic precision of 3 decades in television. Good evening. I'm Ed Sullivan, and tonight we have the pleasure of speaking once again with 4 lads from Liverpool who've taken America by storm, the Beatles. The studio audience erupted in screams that seemed to come from another universe. Ed heard his own voice conducting the interview, asking about their tour, their new songs, their plans, but it felt like listening to a stranger. His real attention was locked on that figure in the shadows, motionless as a sentinel. "Tell us about your experience here in America," he heard himself say, while his peripheral vision strained to catch any movement from camera 3. The figure hadn't shifted position since the cameras rolled, just stood there, watching, like Marcy used to watch him practice his radio announcements in their cramped Bronx apartment. Paul McCartney's voice bubbled with enthusiasm. "Oh, it's been absolutely mad, Ed. The fans, the energy, we never expected anything like this." Ed nodded, smiled, played his part. But beneath the interviewer's desk, his left hand found the telegram in his jacket pocket, fingertips tracing the edges of the paper like a rosary. The studio's heat made his shirt cling to his back, but his hands remained cold as January. "And, John," Ed continued, muscle memory guiding him through the motions, "you've said the American audiences are different from what you're used to back home." As Lennon answered with that characteristic wit, Ed's mind drifted to Betty. She'd be in her living room in Westchester right now, probably with little Eddie on her lap, his grandson named after him, carrying on the Sullivan legacy. Betty always watched his shows, loyal as sunrise. She'd inherited Marcy's eyes, those deep brown pools that could see straight through pretense to the truth beneath. What would those eyes look like when they learned what kind of man her father really was? The interview flowed around him like water around a stone. He asked about their songwriting process while remembering Marcy's own attempts at poetry, the notebooks she'd filled with verses about love and loss and the crushing weight of dreams deferred. He'd found them after the funeral, stacked neatly in her dresser drawer beneath her silk scarves that still carried the faint scent of her perfume, white shoulders. "We understand you're working on a new album," Ed said, his voice steady as bedrock despite the earthquake happening inside his chest. The figure by camera 3 remained perfectly still, but something about their posture suggested coiled tension, like a cat preparing to spring. George Harrison leaned into his microphone. "That's right, Ed. We're quite excited about it. Some of our best work yet, I think." Best work. The phrase echoed in Ed's mind with bitter irony. His best work had been the performance he'd given after Marcy's death, the grieving widower, devastated but brave, channeling his loss into his art. The insurance money had bought him his first real break in television, funding the move to New York, the connections, the gradual climb to this throne he now occupied. Built on bones, built on silence, built on one terrible moment of cowardice that had shaped every day since. The studio's air conditioning hummed, but sweat still beaded on his forehead. In the control booth, he could see the director's satisfied expression. The interview was going smoothly, the Beatles were charming as always, the ratings would be spectacular. CBS executives would be pleased, sponsors would be happy. America would tune in again next Sunday, expecting the same Ed Sullivan they'd always known. "Ringo," Ed said, his autopilot navigation finding the next question, "what's it like being part of this phenomenon?" As the drummer answered with that gentle humor that had made him America's favorite Beatle, Ed caught a flicker of movement from the shadowy figure. Not much, just a slight tilt of the head, but enough to confirm his certainty. The way they moved, the careful precision of each gesture, the patience of someone who'd waited 34 years for this moment. Marcy had always been patient. Patient with his failed auditions, his rejected scripts, his mounting desperation as the bills piled up and the loan sharks circled closer. She'd believed in him even when he'd stopped believing in himself. Right up until that last night, when the pressure had finally cracked her like an eggshell. "We have time for just one more question," Ed announced, though he had no memory of checking the clock. His body was performing while his soul prepared for judgment. "What message do you have for all the young people watching tonight?" Paul's face lit up with that boyish sincerity that had captivated a continent. "Just to follow your dreams, really. We were 4 lads from Liverpool with nothing but guitars and hope. If we can make it, anyone can. Follow your dreams." Ed almost laughed at the cosmic cruelty of it. He'd followed his dreams, all right. Followed them right over Marcy's grave and into this glittering prison of celebrity. And now the dead were coming home to collect their due. The interview wrapped with practiced efficiency. Handshakes, smiles, waves to the screaming audience. But as the cameras powered down and the studio lights dimmed, Ed's eyes found the shadows near camera 3. Empty. The figure was gone, dissolved back into the darkness like a half-remembered nightmare. But the telegram in his pocket felt heavier than ever, and Ed Sullivan knew with the certainty of a condemned man that this was just the beginning. Inciting incident. The backstage corridor felt like a tomb after the electric chaos of the studio. Ed's footsteps echoed against concrete walls painted institutional green, each sound sharp as a gunshot in the sudden quiet. The Beatles had been whisked away by their handlers, their laughter fading into the building's maze of dressing rooms and exit doors. Behind him, the cleanup crew was already breaking down the set, their efficiency erasing all evidence of what might have been his final performance. Ed loosened his tie, the silk feeling like a noose around his throat. His dressing room waited at the corridor's end, a sanctuary where he could collapse, think, plan his next move. But as he approached the door, something stopped him cold. Light spilled from beneath it, warm yellow light that hadn't been there when he'd left for the interview. His hand froze on the doorknob. He'd given explicit instructions to the cleaning staff: no one enters his private space during broadcasts. It was a rule carved in stone, respected by everyone from janitors to network executives. The cleaning crew had their own keys, but they knew better than to cross Ed Sullivan's boundaries. The telegram crackled in his pocket as he turned the handle, metal cold against his palm. The door swung open with a whisper, revealing his dressing room exactly as he'd left it. Leather chair positioned just so, makeup mirror surrounded by bulbs, costume rack holding his backup suits. Everything normal, everything in place, except for the photograph on his dressing table. Ed's breath caught in his throat. There, propped against his makeup mirror where it couldn't possibly be missed, stood a black and white photograph in a silver frame. A wedding photo. His wedding photo, taken 36 years ago outside St. Patrick's Cathedral. He remembered that day with crystalline clarity, October 12, 1928. Marcy in her mother's dress, lace yellowed with age but radiant on her slight frame. His own face, young and hopeful, arm wrapped protectively around his bride's waist. The photograph had been destroyed. He was certain of it. After the funeral, he'd burned everything that might trigger memories. Photos, letters, the small mementos of their brief marriage. This picture had gone into the flames first, curling and blackening until only ash remained. Yet here it was, impossibly present and perfectly preserved. Ed stepped closer, his legs moving against his better judgment. The photograph was exactly as he remembered, even down to the small crack in the lower right corner where he'd dropped the frame during their move to Connecticut. But something was different. Something that made his skin crawl with primal terror. Marcy's face had been carefully circled in red ink. Fresh red ink. The kind that came from a fountain pen, still slightly wet at the edges where it had pooled in the photograph's grain. Below the circle, in handwriting he recognized like his own reflection, someone had written a single word. Soon. Ed's hand shot out to steady himself against the dressing table, sending small cosmetics containers clattering to the floor. The sound seemed to come from very far away, muffled by the roar of blood in his ears. This wasn't possible. The photograph was ash. The handwriting belonged to a woman 34 years dead. The red ink was... His telephone rang. The black rotary phone on his desk, the private line known only to family and CBS executives, shrilled with mechanical persistence. Ed stared at it as if it were a cobra, coiled and ready to strike. 7 rings. 8. 9. On the 10th ring, his hand moved without conscious command, lifting the receiver to his ear. Hello? His voice was barely a whisper. Silence. Then the sound of breathing, slow, deliberate, patient as a predator. Ed pressed the phone closer to his ear, straining to hear anything that might identify the caller. Street noise, music, voices in the background. Nothing. "I know you're there," he said, his words gaining strength. "What do you want?" More breathing. Then, impossibly, a sound that turned his blood to ice water, humming. A woman's voice, soft and melodic, humming the tune they'd danced to at their wedding reception. "The Way You Look Tonight." Marcy's favorite song, the one she'd hummed while doing dishes in their Connecticut kitchen. The humming stopped abruptly. The voice was older than he remembered, weathered by years and pain, but unmistakably hers, unmistakably Marcy. "We need to talk." The line went dead. Ed stood frozen in the sudden silence, receiver clutched in his white-knuckled grip, staring at the impossible photograph. The dressing room walls seemed to close in around him, the familiar space transformed into a trap. 34 years of carefully constructed lies crumbled like sandcastles before the tide. His dead wife was alive, and she was coming for him. The receiver slipped from Ed's numb fingers, clattering against the dressing table before swinging on its cord like a pendulum. The dial tone buzzed with mechanical indifference, but he couldn't move to replace it. His legs had turned to water, his chest tight as a vice. This isn't happening. This can't be happening. But the photograph stared back at him, Marcy's face circled in that damning red ink. Her eyes seemed to follow him as he stumbled backward, hitting the wall hard enough to rattle the framed reviews hanging there, 30 years of glowing praise for the man who'd built his empire on a lie. A sharp knock on the door made him jump like a guilty child. "Mr. Sullivan?" Charlie Morrison's voice carried through the wood, unusually tight. "Everything all right in there? We heard sounds." Ed's mouth opened, but no words came. The photograph seemed to pulse in his peripheral vision, that red circle bleeding into his consciousness like a fresh wound. "Sir?" Charlie's voice again, higher now, worried. "Fine," Ed managed, his voice a hoarse whisper. He cleared his throat, tried again. "I'm fine, Charlie, just tired." Silence stretched from the hallway. Ed could picture his assistant standing there, probably wringing his hands the way he did when something wasn't adding up. Charlie had been with him for 12 years, long enough to read Ed's moods like sheet music, long enough to know when something was terribly wrong. "The network executives want to debrief," Charlie said finally. "The ratings estimate came back, highest numbers of the season. They're calling it a triumph." A triumph. Ed almost laughed, but the sound would have been broken glass. Through the door he could hear other voices now, murmurs, whispers, the careful tone people used when they thought someone might be having a breakdown. "Tell them tomorrow," Ed said. "Schedule something for tomorrow." "But sir," Mr. Paley specifically asked. "Tomorrow." The word exploded from him with enough force to silence the hallway. Ed pressed his palms against his temples, feeling sweat despite the dressing room's chill. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully modulated, the professional mask sliding back into place. "Please give my apologies to Mr. Paley. It's been a long day." Footsteps retreated, but not all of them. Someone remained outside his door, Charlie probably, or maybe one of the CBS security guards. Ed could feel their presence like a weight against his chest. They were starting to whisper now, voices too low to make out words but loud enough to carry concern. He moved to the photograph with the reluctant steps of a man approaching his own execution. Up close, the red ink gleamed wetly under the dressing room lights. The handwriting was definitely Marcy's. He'd know those careful loops anywhere, the way she crossed her T's with mathematical precision. She'd always been proud of her penmanship, one of the few accomplishments her strict Catholic education had given her. But Marcy was dead. He'd seen the body, attended the funeral, thrown dirt on the coffin. The insurance investigator had been thorough. Suicide by gunshot, case closed, check written, new life purchased with blood money. Unless... Ed's hands trembled as he lifted the photograph. The silver frame was warm, as if someone had been holding it recently. He turned it over, looking for some clue, some explanation that might preserve his sanity. Nothing. Just the manufacturer's mark, and a small sticker from the photography studio, where they'd had their portraits taken. A sound in the hallway made him freeze, heels clicking against concrete, approaching with purpose. Not Charlie's nervous shuffle or the heavy tread of security. These steps belonged to someone smaller, lighter, moving with the confidence of someone who belonged here. The footsteps stopped directly outside his door. Ed waited, holding his breath, but no knock came. Just presence, patient, watchful, familiar. Through the door's frosted glass window, he could make out a shadow, motionless as a statue, the same way Marcy used to stand outside his home office when she had something difficult to say, gathering courage for conversations about money, about his drinking, about the baby they'd lost. The shadow moved, reaching toward the door handle. Ed lunged forward, his hand slapping against the lock just as the handle began to turn. The metallic click of the deadbolt seemed to echo like a gunshot, and the shadow on the other side went perfectly still. Ed, the voice, came through the door, muffled but unmistakable. Not Marcy's voice exactly. Older, rougher, shaped by decades of whatever hell she'd been living, but close enough to stop his heart. "I know you're listening." Ed pressed his back against the door, feeling like the last defender of a lost city. In the hallway, the whispers had stopped. Even Charlie's nervous breathing had gone silent. Whatever was happening, it was scaring everyone. 34 years, the voice continued, patient as cancer. 34 years I've waited, but I'm tired of waiting now. The shadow moved away from the door, heels clicking into the distance until they faded completely. Ed remained frozen against the wood, listening to his own thundering heartbeat and the whispered conversations of people who were beginning to understand that Ed Sullivan was no longer the man they thought they knew. The silence stretched until Ed's muscles cramped from tension. When he finally stepped away from the door, his legs nearly gave out. The photograph waited on his dressing table like evidence at a crime scene. Marcy's circled face watching him with dead eyes that somehow seemed more alive than they had any right to be. His hands shook as he reached for the bottom desk drawer, fingers fumbling with the hidden catch he'd installed years ago. Inside, beneath contracts and old scripts, lay the manila folder he'd hoped never to touch again. The insurance papers, police reports, coroner's findings, and buried at the bottom, wrapped in brown paper like something radioactive, the photographs from that night. Ed had paid the crime scene photographer extra to make personal copies before the official investigation closed. Not for blackmail or leverage, he wasn't that kind of man, but because he'd needed proof of what he'd done, what he'd failed to do. Physical evidence of the moment his cowardice had crystallized into something permanent and unforgivable. The photographs spilled across his dressing table with a whisper of old paper, black and white images of their Connecticut kitchen, the overturned chair, the broken glass, the dark stains spreading across linoleum like spilled ink, and there, in the corner of one frame, barely visible in the shadows, his own shoes, brown Oxford wingtips, the ones Marcy had bought him for their 2nd anniversary. Proof that he'd been there, proof that he'd watched, proof that when she'd begged him to stop her, when the gun had trembled in her hands like a live thing, he'd chosen his career over her life. The insurance money had been generous, enough to move to New York, to buy his way into the right circles, to transform himself from Ed Sullivan, failed vaudeville producer, into Ed Sullivan, television impresario. He told himself it was what Marcy would have wanted, her sacrifice given meaning through his success. But looking at these photographs now, he saw only the lie he'd been living. The woman in his dressing room hadn't killed herself that night. She'd been murdered by his silence, by his calculation, by the moment he'd weighed her life against his ambition and found her wanting. A soft knock interrupted his spiraling thoughts, different from Charlie's urgent tapping or the security guard's professional rap. This was gentle, almost apologetic. "Daddy?" Ed's heart stopped. Betty. His daughter stood in the hallway, probably worried sick after the whispered reports of his erratic behavior. He could picture her perfectly, still beautiful at 31, wearing one of those sensible dresses she favored, her dark hair styled in the same victory rolls Marcy had worn during their marriage. Sometimes the resemblance was so strong it made him dizzy. "Betty?" His voice cracked like a teenager's. "Sweetheart, what are you doing here?" "Charlie called me. He said you seemed upset. I was worried." The concern in her voice nearly undid him. Betty had been only 3 when Marcy died, too young to remember the details but old enough to sense the grief that had shaped her childhood. She'd grown up believing her mother was a saint who'd been taken too soon by tragedy. the devoted wife who'd supported her husband's dreams until depression claimed her. Ed had crafted that narrative carefully, brick by brick, until even he sometimes believed it. "I'm fine," he lied, sweeping the photographs back into their folder. But his movements were too quick, too desperate. One image escaped his grasp, sliding across the dressing table to flutter toward the floor. "Daddy, please, let me in. We can talk about whatever's troubling you." The escaped photograph lay face down on the carpet, but Ed could see the corner of the image, that telltale dark stain that had haunted his dreams for 3 decades. If Betty saw it, if she understood what it meant, it would destroy everything, not just his reputation, but her entire understanding of who she was. The daughter of a saint would become the daughter of a suicide. The daughter of a loving husband would become the daughter of a killer. "I need a moment," Ed said, dropping to his knees to retrieve the photograph. His arthritic joints protested, but terror gave him speed. "Just give me a moment to collect myself. Are you sick? Should I call a doctor?" Yes, he thought wildly. Call someone. Call everyone, because I'm dying inside, and I don't know how to stop it. Instead, he forced steel into his voice. "I'm not sick, just tired." The Beatles interview was intense. Through the frosted glass, he watched Betty's shadow shift. She was checking her watch, probably calculating how long until the babysitter expected her home. Little Eddie would be asking for his bedtime story soon. The same fairy tales Ed had once read to Betty, back when he'd believed in happy endings. "All right," Betty said finally, "but promise you'll call if you need anything. Tom's working late, so I could come back if—" "No." The word came out sharper than intended. "No, sweetheart. Go home to your son. Kiss him goodnight for his grandfather." Her footsteps retreated with reluctant concern, leaving Ed alone with his ghosts and the terrible knowledge that somewhere in the building, his past was walking the halls in flesh and blood, ready to collect 34 years of accumulated interest on his debt. Ed remained on his knees long after Betty's footsteps faded, the retrieved photograph trembling in his arthritic hands. The crime scene image seemed to burn his fingertips. That kitchen floor, that dark stain, those brown Oxford shoes that proved his presence at the moment of truth. He'd stared at this photograph countless times over the years, each viewing a form of penance that never quite absolved his sin. But now, as he studied the image with the desperate intensity of a man facing execution, something caught his eye, something that had been there all along, hiding in plain sight for 34 years. The telephone on the kitchen wall. In the photograph, it hung at an odd angle, the receiver dangling by its cord as if someone had dropped it mid-conversation. He'd always assumed Marcy had been trying to call for help, perhaps having second thoughts about what she was planning to do. But there was something else, a detail so small he'd missed it through decades of guilt to blurred examination. The telephone's rotary dial was turned, frozen between numbers, not hanging freely as it would if someone had simply dropped the receiver, but positioned deliberately, pointing to a specific number, 7. Ed's blood turned to ice water. 7 had been their private signal, established during their courtship when Marcy lived with her suspicious Catholic parents. 7 rings meant "I love you." 7 knocks meant "meet me outside." 7 was their secret language, their intimate code that no one else could possibly know. Unless someone had forced her to make that call. Unless someone had been there that night who knew their private signals. Unless the woman on the other end of that call, the woman who had hummed their wedding song into his telephone just minutes ago, had been listening to Marcy's final message 34 years ago. The dressing room walls seemed to shift around him as the implications crashed through his consciousness like artillery shells. He hadn't been the only witness to Marcy's death. Someone else had been there, someone close enough to know their most intimate secrets, someone who had let him believe for 3 decades that he was the sole keeper of that terrible night's truth. The insurance investigator's report had been thorough but not perfect. Ed pulled it from the folder with shaking hands, scanning details he'd memorized but never truly examined. Single gunshot wound, door locked from inside, no signs of struggle. Case closed. But there, buried in the coroner's technical language, a detail that suddenly blazed with new significance. Victim's fingernails contained traces of foreign skin cells, suggesting recent physical contact with another individual. Ed had always assumed those skin cells belonged to him. He'd held Marcy's hands that night, hadn't he? Touched her face when she begged him to stop her. But what if they belonged to someone else entirely? Someone who had been there before he arrived. Someone who had staged the scene and waited for him to stumble into their trap. The telephone in his dressing room began to ring again. This time, Ed snatched it up before the first ring finished, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Who are you?" "Oh, Eddie." The voice was different now. Not the weathered tones of an older Marcy, but something else entirely. Something that made his skin crawl with recognition. "You still don't understand, do you? Even after all these years, you still think this is about her. Marcy? Marcy's dead, you fool." The voice turned sharp, cutting through his confusion like a blade. "She died exactly the way the police said she did. The only lie is the one you've been telling yourself, that you were the monster in that room." Ed's grip on the receiver tightened until his knuckles went white. "Then who?" "Someone who loved her more than you ever did. Someone who watched you destroy her spirit day by day, drink by drink, broken promise by broken promise. Someone who was there that night to save her from you." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The intimate knowledge of their relationship, the access to their private photographs, the patient 34-year wait for the perfect moment to strike. Not a ghost returning from the dead, but someone who had been alive all along, watching his rise to fame with growing resentment. "Margaret," he whispered. Marcy's sister laughed, cold and bitter as winter wind. "Took you long enough. Though I suppose guilt makes people stupid. All these years you've tortured yourself, thinking you let her die when you could have saved her. But she was already dead when you got there, Ed. I made sure of that." The revelation hit him like a physical blow. "You killed her. I freed her. From you. From the misery you brought into her life. And then I watched you build your empire on her blood money, telling yourself you were honoring her memory while you got fat and famous off her death." Ed's carefully constructed world crumbled around him. 34 years of assumed guilt, revealed as misdirected torment. He hadn't been a coward who failed to save his wife. He'd been a patsy, manipulated and positioned to take the psychological burden for a murder he never committed. "You let me suffer," he said, his voice barely audible. "I let you live," Margaret replied, which was more mercy than you deserved. "But mercy has an expiration date, Ed, and yours is about to run out." The phone went dead in Ed's hand, but he couldn't release it. His fingers had locked around the receiver like rigor mortis. 34 years of misplaced guilt transforming into something far more dangerous: rage. Margaret. Marcy's younger sister, the sanctimonious Catholic girl who'd never approved of their marriage, who'd whispered poison in Marcy's ear about Ed's drinking, his failed productions, his late nights chasing impossible dreams, who'd convinced Marcy that she was married to a man destined for mediocrity. But Margaret had been wrong, dead wrong. And now Ed Sullivan, the real Ed Sullivan, not the guilt-ridden ghost who'd haunted these halls for decades, was about to remind her of that fact. He set the receiver down with deliberate care and moved to his private bathroom mirror. The man staring back looked haggard, beaten, older than his 62 years. But beneath the surface damage, Ed could see something stirring that had been dormant since 1930. The ruthless ambition that had once driven him to claw his way up from nothing. The killer instinct that Margaret had never understood. She thought she'd broken him with her revelation, thought she'd delivered a crushing blow by admitting to murder. But Margaret had made the same mistake that every small-minded person made when facing someone truly dangerous. She'd assumed that guilt was weakness. Ed straightened his tie and smoothed his hair. In the mirror, he watched his professional mask reassemble itself. Not the brittle facade he'd worn all day, but the genuine article. The face of a man who'd built a television empire from blood money and was about to protect that empire by any means necessary. The CBS building hummed around him with late-evening activity. Janitors working their way through the upper floors, security guards making their rounds, a skeleton crew preparing for tomorrow's programming, all of them loyal CBS employees who understood that Ed Sullivan wasn't just the host of a variety show. He was the network's golden goose, the man whose Sunday night ratings kept paychecks flowing. They would help him if he asked. They would look the other way if necessary. They would choose institutional loyalty over inconvenient questions about a disturbed woman making threats against their most valuable asset. Ed opened his desk drawer and pulled out the CBS building directory, flipping to the security section. Frank Morrison, head of corporate security, lived in Queens with his wife and 3 daughters. Good man, 20-year company veteran, absolutely devoted to protecting CBS interests. Frank would understand the situation immediately. A delusional woman stalking Ed Sullivan needed to be handled quietly and permanently. But as Ed reached for the phone, his hand froze over the receiver. Through his dressing room door, he could hear familiar voices in the hallway. Charlie's nervous chatter, the measured tones of a CBS executive, and underneath it all, the soft click of heels approaching with patient certainty. Margaret was coming back, not skulking in shadows this time, but walking openly through the building as if she belonged here, as if 34 years of waiting had finally given her the right to claim what she believed was owed. Ed moved to his dressing room window and peered through the blinds at the street below. February darkness had settled over Manhattan, but the sidewalks still swarmed with pedestrians hurrying through the cold. Anonymous faces in a city of 8 million people, the perfect place for someone to disappear without a trace. Margaret had survived 3 decades of hiding. She knew how to vanish when necessary. But she'd made one critical error. She'd revealed herself on Ed's territory, in the building where he was king, surrounded by people who owed their livelihoods to his continued success. She'd abandoned the shadows for a moment of theatrical confrontation, and that moment of ego would be her downfall. The heel stopped outside his door again. This time, no attempt at stealth or psychological manipulation. Margaret knocked with the crisp authority of someone who expected to be admitted immediately. "Edward." Her voice carried clearly through the door, loud enough for anyone in the hallway to hear. "We need to finish our conversation." Ed could picture Charlie and the executives exchanging worried glances. They'd be wondering who this woman was, how she'd gotten past security, why Ed Sullivan was hiding in his dressing room instead of handling the situation like the consummate professional they knew him to be. Perfect. Let them wonder. Let them see their golden goose under threat from an obvious lunatic. Let them understand that protecting Ed meant protecting their own futures. He unlocked his door and pulled it open with the smooth confidence of a man who just remembered he held all the cards. Margaret stood in the hallway, smaller than he'd remembered, aged but not broken. Behind her, Charlie and 2 CBS executives watched with the careful attention of people witnessing something they didn't yet understand but knew was important. "Margaret," Ed said, his voice carrying perfectly to his audience. "After all these years." Margaret smiled, but her eyes held the cold calculation of someone who'd spent 34 years planning this moment. She looked older than Ed had expected, her dark hair streaked with silver, lines etched around her mouth from decades of harbored resentment, but she carried herself with the rigid posture of a woman who'd never doubted her righteousness. "You look well, Edward," she said, loud enough for Charlie and the executives to hear every word. "Success agrees with you. Fame built on blood money usually does." Ed felt the executives stiffen behind her, their confusion sharpening into professional concern. Charlie stepped forward with the protective instinct of a 20-year employee who'd seen Ed handle difficult guests, drunk celebrities, and network politics with unflappable grace. "Mr. Sullivan, should I call security?" Charlie's voice carried the weight of institutional authority, CBS protecting its own. "Not yet," Ed replied smoothly, his television smile never wavering. "Margaret is an old family friend. Aren't you Margaret, Marcy's sister, visiting from—" He paused deliberately, letting the silence build. "Where have you been living these days?" It was a calculated strike. Margaret had spent 3 decades hiding, and Ed was reminding her and his witnesses that she was the one who'd been running. She was the one who'd lived in shadows while he'd built an empire in the spotlight. Margaret's composure flickered for just a moment. "I've been waiting," she said, stepping closer to Ed's doorway. "Watching you profit from my sister's death, building your precious television show on the foundation of her grave." "Your sister committed suicide," Ed said with the patient tone of someone correcting a persistent delusion. "It was tragic. It nearly destroyed me. But I honored her memory by making something of my life." "Honored her memory?" Margaret's voice rose, cracking with 3 decades of suppressed fury. You abandoned her when she needed you most. You chose your pathetic career over her life, and when she couldn't bear it anymore. When she couldn't bear what? Ed interrupted, his voice sharp as a blade. He stepped closer, invading her personal space with the confidence of a man on his own territory. When she couldn't bear being married to a man who was building something? When she couldn't handle the temporary struggles that come with ambition? Behind Margaret, Charlie and the executives exchanged glances. This was starting to sound like family drama. Messy, emotional, the kind of thing that could damage CBS if it got out. Ed could see them calculating, weighing their loyalty against potential scandal. Margaret's hands trembled as she reached into her purse. For a moment, Ed tensed, wondering if she'd brought a weapon. But what she pulled out was far more dangerous than a gun, a manila envelope, thick with documents. "I have proof," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "Police photographs, insurance reports, evidence that you were there that night when she died." Ed felt his carefully constructed facade threatening to crack. The photographs, she had the crime scene photos, the ones that showed his shoes in the corner, proof that he'd been in the kitchen when Marcy pulled the trigger. After 34 years, his greatest fear was being realized in front of the very people whose respect had defined his existence. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of panic, Ed felt a surge of cold clarity. Margaret thought she was destroying him with evidence of his guilt, but she'd revealed something far more important. She still believed he was responsible for Marcy's death, which meant she was lying about committing murder herself. "Show them," Ed said quietly, gesturing toward Charlie and the executives. "Go ahead, Margaret. Show them your proof." Margaret hesitated, confusion flickering across her features. This wasn't the reaction she'd expected. She'd come here to watch him grovel, to see him destroyed by the revelation of his presence at the scene. She wasn't prepared for him to call her bluff. "These photographs prove you were there," she said, but her voice lacked the conviction of moments before. "They prove you watched her die." "They prove I tried to save her," Ed replied with the smooth authority of a master performer. "They prove that when I got the call, when I realized what she was planning, I rushed home to stop her, and I was too late." He turned to address Charlie and the executives directly, his voice carrying the warm sincerity that millions of Americans trusted every Sunday night. "Gentlemen, this poor woman has been living with grief and guilt for over 30 years. She blames me for her sister's suicide because she can't accept that some tragedies have no villain. Some deaths can't be prevented, no matter how much we love someone." Charlie's expression shifted from concern to protective sympathy. The executives nodded with the understanding of men who'd seen how fame attracted unstable people, seeking someone to blame for their pain. Margaret stared at Ed in horrified recognition. She'd spent decades planning this confrontation, but she'd underestimated the man she was facing. The broken, guilt-ridden widower she remembered from 1930 was gone, replaced by someone who could rewrite reality with the confidence of absolute authority. "You're lying," she whispered. "No," Ed replied gently. "I'm surviving." "Security will escort you out," Charlie said quietly, already reaching for his radio. "And Miss Sullivan, is it?" "I think it's best if you don't contact Mr. Sullivan again." Margaret looked at the faces surrounding her, Charlie's protective authority, the executive's dismissive concern, Ed's gentle smile that never reached his eyes. She'd imagined this moment 1,000 different ways, but never like this. Never as the broken one, the delusional sister, the woman who couldn't accept tragedy. "You win," she whispered, clutching the photographs that had once seemed so damning. "You always win." Ed watched her being led away, her footsteps echoing down the hallway until they faded into the building's eternal hum. Charlie and the executives lingered, offering concerned reassurances about security protocols and screening procedures. Ed nodded at appropriate intervals, his television smile never faltering, but his mind was elsewhere. When the hallway finally emptied, Ed returned to his dressing room and closed the door. The silence pressed against him like a physical weight. For the first time in hours, he was alone with the truth, not Margaret's truth, not CBS's truth, but the real truth that would die with him. He'd been there that night, he'd watched Marcy die, and he'd built his empire on the foundation of that terrible moment, just as Margaret had accused. The guilt that had driven him for 3 decades hadn't been misplaced after all. It had been earned, cultivated, transformed into the relentless ambition that made Ed Sullivan a household name. But guilt, he'd learned, was just another performance, another role to master. Ed opened his desk drawer and pulled out a photograph of Marcy from their wedding day. She looked radiant in white lace, her eyes bright with hope for their future together. He'd kept this picture hidden for 34 years, too painful to display but too precious to discard. "I'm sorry," he said to the photograph, his voice barely audible in the empty room, "not for surviving, not for succeeding, but for forgetting who you really were, because that was the truth Margaret had never understood. Marcy hadn't died because Ed was absent, she'd died because he was exactly who he'd always been. Ambitious, ruthless, willing to sacrifice anything for his vision of success. The man who could rewrite history with a smile and a smooth voice had been there all along. Even in 1930, Marcy had simply been the first casualty of his ascension. The phone on his desk rang once, then stopped. Ed stared at it, remembering all the calls that had led to this moment, the threats, the revelations, the final confrontation that had ended not in his destruction but in his complete triumph. Margaret would disappear back into whatever shadows had hidden her for 3 decades. The photographs would gather dust in some forgotten file. CBS would continue to pay him handsomely for bringing America its Sunday night entertainment. He should feel victorious. He should feel relief. Instead, Ed Sullivan felt nothing at all. That numbness would follow him home to his Park Avenue apartment, where he'd pour himself 3 fingers of bourbon and sit in his leather chair overlooking the city he'd conquered. It would stay with him through the quiet dinner with his wife, the woman who'd helped him build this life but had never known its true foundation. It would keep him awake at night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of a city that never slept. 3 months later, when the newspapers reported Margaret Sullivan's death in a Queens boarding house apparent suicide, no note, no family to claim the body, Ed would read the obituary twice and feel that same careful numbness. He would attend the funeral with appropriate solemnity, placing flowers on the grave of a woman who'd loved his wife more than he ever could. And on Sunday nights, when the cameras rolled and America watched Ed Sullivan bring them their weekly dose of variety and wonder, they would see exactly what they'd always seen. A man who'd survived tragedy and built something beautiful from the ashes. A man who understood that some performances never end. The last truth, the one that would follow Ed Sullivan to his own grave 27 years later, was this: he'd become exactly what he'd always wanted to be. Not despite the guilt, but because of it. Not in spite of Marcy's death, but through it. In the end, that was worth any price, even his soul.